Our subject tonight is learning and attention problems. For those of you who are new to us, let me tell you just a little bit about who we are as an organization. NACD was established in 1979. We're an international organization with 14 chapters or units around the United States and 3 international chapters. We work with a full range of individuals, from those in coma to gifted and talented, and everything in between. We're an eclectic organization, meaning that we utilize over 3,000 different specific methods and techniques with our caseload. And over the course of the years, we've designed and directed, my staff tells me, over 3 million individual hours of intervention. We're in rather a unique position as an organization. As I said, we are international. We send our staff around the country, outside of the country. We work with children from virtually all over the world. And it provides us with some nice opportunities. Number one, we get to find out what's going on pretty much everywhere. We deal with kind of the top of the line of parents. You know, the parents of the kids we see are parents who are assuming responsibility for their kids' development, parents who are active participants, and parents who are out looking for what works. As such, we're uniquely positioned to find out what's going on, and because our families are kind of doing everything there is to do, we're getting a lot of very, very good information relative to what does and does not work, and if it does work, for whom will it work? One of the things that's difficult in the field of child development is, for the most part, practitioners function autonomously. Meaning, whether you're talking about a physical therapist, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, a psychologist, an educator, pretty much all of them are doing their thing with their caseload, which is generally, relatively speaking, a small caseload. And we're in the position where we're dealing typically with about 1,000 kids, and all of our staff approach the same issues the same way. So as a team, we're able to evaluate what's working, what's not working, what we need to change, what we need to modify, and we're in a constant state of flux, evaluating what works, what doesn't work, and looking for ways to do it better. And we talk about working from the perspective of a parent, which essentially means we can never do it well enough or fast enough. Okay. Another thing that's significant relative to the field, and in my perception, lack of development in the field, is that many, many practitioners represent a specific technique or methodology. You know, this person does that person does that, and they attempt to apply that methodology with a broad range of kids and just do more and more the same thing. It's very important, if we are changing brains, if we are affecting significant change in children, that we are as specific as we can possibly be with the individual. There most certainly is no one-size-fits-all. All right, and the real challenge is understanding what's going on with that specific child and helping to address that specific child's particular needs. So that's kind of who we are in a nutshell. Right? A part of what I want to communicate tonight is the need, if you will, to virtually redefine what education is. The operational definition of education today is something like attempting to provide children with the skills they need to function in society. And there was a time in history where that was probably a reasonable definition and a reasonable approach. But in this day and age, it really isn't, because the science is such that the goal, the definition, should be more like providing the child with the ability to access their innate intelligence. Now that's a very significant difference, because the perspective needs to be that the child who walks into that school on their first day is a child waiting to happen, as opposed to the perception essentially is what you get on that first day is what's going to walk out in 12 years. And you're going to try to teach that child with that brain as much as you can. All right, the goal needs to be to unlock the potential. And that happens by really understanding the function of the individual and providing opportunities for, if you will, brain growth and brain development, and understand who that child is and what that child needs in terms of educational opportunities and specific stimulation to realize that innate potential. Beyond that, the child needs to be given the basic abilities and strengths to learn well. We need to also equip them with a strong knowledge base, and we also need to create a love of learning. You know, relative to a love of learning, you know, it's kind of interesting. If any of you have preschool kids, most preschool children love learning anything. You know, you could take your 4-year-old and tell your 4-year-old, Susie, we're going to go teach you how to clean the bathroom. All right, and Susie would think that's great fun, okay? I mean, really, anything you want to teach them, they're happy to learn it. Sadly, most kids, we take 12 years and we teach them to hate learning everything, right? Then we graduate them and wish them luck. All right, the system as it exists, you know, very, very, very rarely teaches a child to love the learning process. And as you'll discover through the course of the evening, intensity of the input, which means the child's response and interaction with what's being taught, is a critical piece in being successful in learning. So essentially, if you're really not creating a love of learning, you're really not doing the job. You know, a big part of also what is happening in education nationally is the attention is on curriculum. And the perception is we constantly need to find better curriculum. You know, I honestly don't think we need another 5,000 reading programs or 5,000 math programs, all right? There probably is one out there that'll work, all right, if we individualize what we're doing to some degree. But you know, if curriculum changes really provided significant changes, we would in fact have an outstanding educational system, okay? Because we're constantly changing curriculum. And one of the phenomena I've discovered as I've worked around the country and outside of the country, you know, I can have a family living up in Connecticut with 3 kids, and they have one child who gets A's, one gets C's, and one gets F's. And the family can move to Atlanta, to a new school district, and gee, guess what? They still have one kid who gets A's, one gets C's, and the other one gets F's. And they move to California or wherever, it's the same thing, okay? Because what needs to change is the brains. What needs to change is the child's ability to learn. Right? Changing curriculum doesn't fix that, all right? The job is to assist that child in achieving their innate potential. Okay? And again, tonight we're going to help you understand, hopefully, the pieces to that. Another component that makes this whole process difficult is academically and within the schools, the need to classify. Essentially, classifications become labels. And whether your child gets into school and is labeled as having a learning problem or dyslexia or ADD or ADHD, or even gets the terrible label of average, right? All the labels limit. Okay? Because the perspective attached to every one of them is based on limitations. You know, go into any exceptional psych book or book for those in special education, and you look up any label, and what it's going to tell you are the limitations of those individuals with those labels. Well, guess what? If your perception is that, you're going to provide the opportunities based on that, and that's what you're going to achieve. Someone once said something I think was very significant. They said, what cannot be solved is named. Once named, it does not seem to need a solution. Now think about that for a second. Imagine you have an 8-year-old in 3rd grade who is perceived as smart and normal. And imagine your 3rd grader is having difficulty with reading. Hopefully, with that perception, the teacher, the school is attempting to find a way to help your child learn how to read. Because the perception is your child is normal, he's smart, should be able to read. One thing can change that, and sadly typically does, and that is if somebody to say, well, maybe we should evaluate the child relative to why they're not reading. They do a comprehensive evaluation. At the end of the evaluation, they determine your child is dyslexic. Well, that changes the whole thing, okay? Let's stop working so hard to teach him to read because he's dyslexic, he can't read. All the term dyslexia means is reading difficulty, right? There's no such disease. Okay? But once a child is perceived as having the disease, they're virtually perceived as having an incurable disease. And that is pretty much true of all the labels associated with learning and behavior and attention. Okay? They're symptomatic labels. They're identification of symptom. They're not identification of where the issues are or what's broken. And once the label is given, then they do not look to discover what is in fact broken. As parents, your job is to find out what's broken and work to address it and work to fix it. Let me talk a little bit about general development of the brain. We tend to have a perception that our child's potential is determined before birth. And that kind of, unfortunately, the perception often is for parents that your job is to see that your kid eats reasonably well, does his homework, and doesn't get hit by a truck. And if you do that, the child's going to achieve his innate potential. The reality is a long ways from that. Because the reality essentially is that at the time of birth, most of any child's brain flat out doesn't work. And it's actually through a process of stimulating the brain that the brain develops. Now you can see this pretty graphically just in the physical growth of your child's brain. Your baby starts off with this little skull about this big, all right? This little brain. And over the course of a few years, it grows to something about that big, all right? Well, what happened to that brain? Did it get older? Is that why it grew? No. Matter of fact, there really is, and I'm still looking to find something good about getting older, but it for sure doesn't grow your brain, all right? Stimulation makes your brain grow. And where you can see this is in the case of a brain-injured child. If we have a brain-injured child whose ability to perceive the world is diminished, they're not processing visual information or auditory information or tactile information, their brain is not being stimulated, and because their brain is not being stimulated, their brains literally do not grow. Okay? The brain stays just as it was at birth until something is done to improve the processing so we can in fact stimulate that brain. So the physical growth of your child's brain is a direct result of stimulation. Now, to understand that piece, the brain cells are made up of these pieces. You have a thing called a neuron, and you have connections coming into it and connections going out of it. And essentially at birth, those neurons have very few connections and essentially are not really wired in and functional in the system. As you stimulate the brain, you actually stimulate the growth of those connections. And the physical growth you see is primarily a growth of those connections wiring in of brain cells. Okay? A whole lot of that happens in the first couple years of life. It kind of diminishes after a number of years. Fortunately, it does, to some degree, continue throughout our lifetimes. But the first years are pretty critical years. Now, one of the, I think one of the issues that we have nationally, we talk about the decrease in what's happening educationally over the last 50 years. I think there's a lot of factors involved in that. But I think one of the really major factors is the loss of the opportunity for specific input in a whole lot of young children. And we've changed perceptions, and it's been kind of shocking. I've been in this business pretty much my whole life and professionally since the late 60s, and watching the transitions that have occurred in that time period. At the beginning of my career, one of the realities were we had many, many, many moms who were home, and many, many children who were home. In my time, kids didn't go to school till they were 6. They didn't go anywhere until they were 6. All right? Primarily, they were home with mom, receiving specific input. I can remember in the very early 80s, I did a live TV interview at UCLA Department of Child Development. And at that time, what they were saying there was horrifying to most of the population. Because essentially what they were saying was that a preschool child, home with their mother was inappropriate. And the interview was taking place in their child development center, and it was a big room with a bunch of little kids running around and a few college students. And what they were saying was, this environment is what's appropriate for a preschool child, because this is a stimulating environment. Right? And fortunately, back at that time, a lot of people were rather horrified at that. Unfortunately, today, most people would sit and nod their head and say, oh yeah, that's right. Because we've bought into that perception that mothers that are not up to the task and kids need to be in a daycare, preschool environment to be stimulated. Well, let me explain what is stimulating, all right? We stimulate the brain by identifying specific appropriate input and then supplying that individual with that specific appropriate input with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. Okay. Now, you could have 10 children who are 2 years old, and what is specific and appropriate for one is not going to be specific and appropriate for another. And if we have 10 2-year-old children, 9 of them are a distraction to the one. Okay? The further we get, and I don't care if you're talking about an infant, or somebody who's 50, the further you get from one-to-one input, the less specific it becomes. Okay? If you're working, let's say you're home and you're home with a 4-year-old and you're showing your 4-year-old a book about dinosaurs. If what you're doing is specific and appropriate for your 4-year-old, your 4-year-old is engaged, your 4-year-old is enthusiastic, your 4-year-old is responding. And what happens is, as a parent, you automatically modify what you're doing, even without thinking about it, based on what your 4-year-old does. Okay, because you see the 4-year-old starts getting a little antsy. You maybe increase your volume a little bit more. You maybe do less talking and more looking, pointing at pictures. But you just automatically modify what you're doing to be specific for that child, okay? If you're reading to 2 kids, you're less specific. And if you're reading to 10 kids, you're totally not specific. And if you got 20 or 30 kids, bet on it, there's nothing specific, okay? And we call that random input. And random input not only does not stimulate the brain, random input disorganizes the brain. So in many respects, the worst possible environment you can put a young child in is a room full of another group of young children. Right. Yes, ma'am.
So do you perceive any benefits whatsoever to a preschooler attending 2 hours of preschool 3 days a week, say 6 hours of preschool a week? Do you consider that an inhibitor to their development, or does that have any benefit?
The biggest benefit is a break for mom. Okay, and that's valid. Okay, the older the child, the more possible benefit there is. The younger the child, the less. Okay, if you're talking about 4-year-olds, yeah, a couple hours, a few times a week, you know, that's probably a good thing. Okay, but if you're talking about, you know, 4 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, that for sure is not a good thing. Okay. It may be a necessary thing. I mean, there are realities, you know, and it may be necessary, but if it is necessary, the parent needs to be aware that they've got to compensate for that by providing their kids with as much one-on-one as they can when they can.
I was going to just ask kind of what you were just alluding to. What are those compensating things? What can be done to compensate for those times that the child is not with them?
Well, the job of the parent is largely to become as knowledgeable as they can about this whole process of child development. With that knowledge and, you know, with what support they can get, you can do an awful lot with a little bit of time. I mean, one of the things that's been really fun about the work we've done, most of our kids are kids with issues that we work with directly. And universally, the younger siblings of those children are virtually all accelerated. Okay? Because what the parent learns from working with their child with a problem educates them to the degree that every other child benefits. Okay? And the families that we see that have, if you will, typical kids, what it takes to accelerate and make those kids, put those kids at the top of the heap is so minimal, it's almost shocking. Yeah. I mean, it's really easy. So we want to provide the child with as much specific, appropriate input as we possibly can. And part of that being aware and understanding of development. The development of the brain starts from the bottom up, if you will. At the time of birth, the cortex, the thing most of us are concerned about, really isn't operational yet. All right, it's these lower areas of the brain. And the lower areas are often what are referred to as motor areas of the brain. And actually, for the little kids, moving around is an important function, which creates another problem with the daycare kind of environments. Okay, children ideally are left to be on the floor and learn how to crawl on their stomachs, creep on their hands and knees, and then get up and walk. And, you know, that it doesn't sound like that's a significant deal, but if you think about what that function is, all right, and think that the lower centers are motor centers, when a child learns to crawl on their stomach appropriately, and generally all that means you got to put them down and give them the chance to be there, they move in what's called a cross pattern, which means they pull with their right arm as they push with their left leg, pull left arm, push right leg, all right? That provides the brain with very good integrated information, okay? Moving information in an integrated way through the brain, organizing the brain. When they get up on their hands and knees and creep in a cross pattern, they're reinforcing that. and getting up and walking across pattern, they're reinforcing that. We find that if anything disrupts the normal developmental process, we have some degree of disorganization at all higher levels of the brain. Okay, so kids who have problems, down at the lower levels are going to typically have problems at the upper levels. So your child's learning problem or attention problem may have originated way back when they were little because of missed opportunities. Okay. One of the saddest things is often, particularly first-time parents, very involved parents, often do a bunch of things to louse stuff up. All right. One is they never put the kids down. Okay? And that first mom walks around with that kid attached to her all day long. All right? Wrong. Okay? Child needs to be down, needs to have an opportunity to learn how to move. And of course, that same mom is the mom who maybe puts the child down. The child's there for 10 seconds and whimpers, and she runs and grabs him and picks him up again. Okay? Moms get trained very quickly, all right? And unfortunately, babies are not wise, okay? All right? They don't make good decisions, So we need the parents to be a little wiser than the children and a little more knowledgeable to know, what to do and hopefully to do the right stuff. Now, if we go through these lower areas of the brain and we organize those properly, when we get up into the cortex, all right, the thinking part of the brain, hopefully then it becomes properly organized. And at that level, that's very important because as you get up into the cortex, we start getting what's called lateralization. Lateralization means one hemisphere of the brain, if you will, takes primary control. And that dominant hemisphere of the brain is in charge of some pretty important things, such as logical thought, analytical thought, specific long-term memory, okay? Kind of biggies, all right? If we lack a dominant hemisphere, you can almost equate it with having, if you will, a preschool brain. All right, generally that organization and that laterality kicks in at about 6 years of age. And at 6 years, you can see really the language function taking off, and you really see logical thought and analytical thought. You start seeing control of emotionality with thought. All right, so the kids who do not reach that point where they get that level of organization, to some degree, are what we call neurologically disorganized and lack some of those really important functions. Now, to have a dominant controlling hemisphere, one of the things you see is that you have a dominant controlling hand, eye, ear, and foot that are all on the same side of the body. Okay, meaning if you're right-handed, you should be right-eyed, you should be right-eared, you should be right-footed. Or all left-sided. By the way, there's nothing wrong with being left-sided. Okay? In fact, somebody once said only left-sided people are in their right minds. Okay? By the way, for what it's worth, in my work, I've actually discovered that left-sided people tend in the higher professions are better represented by left than right-sided people. It's an inordinate number of, for example, left-handed doctors. Okay. Lawyers, I don't know. It's not bad to be left, but you want to be all left. I assume you know which is your dominant hand if you have one. Let me show you very quickly how to find out which is your dominant eye if you don't know which one that is. By the way, if you're myopic, all right, if you're nearsighted, chances are your dominant eye is your weaker eye. And you have the stronger prescription typically in your dominant eye. And the reason for that is myopia is created by near-point work. And because your dominant eye is doing more of the work, your dominant eye tends to be more myopic. Okay, to test this quickly, find a spot, like up in the corner, and with both eyes open, point at a spot up on the wall. Okay? Point point, both eyes open. Now close or cover your right eye. Some of you, it's the other right eye. Okay, now, all right, point, again, both eyes open, close or cover the right eye. If your finger appeared to move when you close the right eye, your right eye is probably dominant. Okay, point again, both eyes open. Close or cover your left eye. If it appeared to move when you close the left eye, your left eye is probably dominant. If it moved both times, you do not have a dominant eye. And if you didn't crawl and creep, you're probably confused. By the way, speaking of not crawling and creeping and being confused, there's a British comedian, I don't even know if he's still alive, named Benny Hill. Anyone remember Benny Hill? Benny Hill, if he was being a normal person, okay, as normal people walked out on a stage like this, okay? If he was being one of his many characters who didn't function too well, they walked out on the stage like this, okay, in a homolateral pattern. Right? Smart guy, okay. If you walk in a homolateral pattern, get down and crawl and creep, or you want to fix that, okay. Okay, now that was a very crude test of your far point visual dominance. If we were testing a child, we'd test that in a number of different ways. We'd also test near point visual dominance with some other techniques. And again, both, if you're right-handed, should be on the right or on the left. If you wink, everybody wink one eye. Okay, you probably winked your subdominant eye. Okay? And if you wink both eyes, either you're mixed-eyed or you wink a lot, one or the other. Okay. All right. Auditory dominance. Generally, you know, if you're straining to really hear something, you tend to turn one ear to the sound, and that's probably your dominant ear. Many, many, many people have loused up their auditory dominance with a little thing called a telephone. All right, because you have a tendency to put the phone to what should be your subdominant ear so you can write or do whatever anymore. It used to be just writing, now it's everything. All right. And again, right-handed should be right-eyed, right-eared, right-footed, left-handed, left-eyed, left-eared, and left-footed to go with it. To whatever degree those things are off, you're going to lack those dominant hemisphere functions. And relative to learning issues and attention issues, that dominance can be very, very significant. Okay? So that's something you might want to look at in your kids. Okay? How well we learn is largely a reflection of how well we do what's called receive, process, store, and utilize information. Receiving information means what gets from the world to our brain. And relative to that, we look at problems primarily with vision and problems with hearing. If your kids are having learning problems, one of the first things you want to do is have their vision checked, make sure they can in fact see. All right, problems with visual acuity are something you want to be aware of and acknowledge. If your child does have an acuity problem, let me clue you in on a few things. First of all, if your child's young, as in preschool, preschool children normally are farsighted. And what you want to do about that is nothing. Okay? Because as they go to school and do more near point work, they'll move more to a neutral position. Okay? If you take your child and you get them examined and they tell you the child is myopic, nearsighted, often the best thing to do with that is nothing. One of the things they'll often tell you is you're nearsighted, here's a prescription, come back in a few months because we're going to need to check you again because we're lousing up your vision, you're going to need stronger glasses. Okay. If a prescription is correct, you can see better, but it doesn't help your eyes typically. Okay. Essentially what happens is those things that control your vision don't have to do their job once you get glasses on there. So if you're nearsighted and you get glasses, you tend to get more nearsighted. Farsighted, you get glasses, you tend to get more farsighted. Right? If your child can't see the blackboard at school, you may have to get glasses and encourage a child just to wear them when they have to use them to see the blackboard, then take them off. But there's many, 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 many children who are grossly overcorrected with their vision. There's problems with tracking. You know, your child, yes, sir.
Say if you have a child that hasn't been putting glasses since first grade or thereabouts, he's now in third, can that be reversed by taking him off or having him wear them less, or is it just not fixable?
It depends on the child. Generally, at that age, you can reverse those things fairly easily. The child, you know, and another part of the issue with that, if you as adults go to the eye doctor, they do something called a refraction. All right, they take an instrument and they shine a light and bounce it off your retina to see where the focal point, and that will give them degrees of nearsightedness or farsightedness. But before they put glasses on you, they sit you down with a chart and they put different lenses on you to see what, in fact, you can see. But with your little kids, they don't do that second part. They just do the refraction, all right? And the refraction can give very, very, very wrong readings. So often I have kids literally who come in who the family are told the child's vision is 22,000. You know, they've got, you know, glasses, you know, half-inch thick, you know, and all the parents take the kids' glasses off and we'll have them look at things up close and at distance, and a child can see everything fine. Okay? Something's wrong. Okay? So, yeah, I can't tell you how many children we see who come in with horrendous prescriptions and end up within very short periods of time having normal vision. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I have a 9-year-old that actually had her eyes checked, and she had them dilated. And at that point, the eye doctor said that she just couldn't see. And so he recommended that I should get glasses for her. And I did, but here's my daughter saying, Mom, I can see better without them. And it's like they say that she's farsighted. It's just like up close type things. She
Yeah.
might have some difficulty. They might be straining her. But they said if she wears them for a certain length of time, that they should get better. And I guess I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, my opinion is not. Generally, you know, I mean, particularly with little girls, you know, do strange things, you know. You know, little girls ask for glasses, you know, and lie about, yeah, I can see better, you know. So if she's saying she can't, I believe she can see better with the glasses. So
She actually says that she can see better
without, that's what I'm saying. If she says she's better without, then she's better without. Yeah. By the way, other little things, you know, another strange thing little 9-year-old girls do. Now, I talked about the dominance deal. Little girls, I've never heard of a little boy doing this. Little girls at like 9 start practicing writing with the other hand. A lot of them do that. I don't get that. But, yeah. So for sure, she says she sees better without them. Question whether or not they're correct. And when he dilated her eyes, he did the refraction. That's what he did. Dilating the eyes makes it easier to do the process.
How about astigmatism? When they tell you they have astigmatism in both eyes.
Astigmatism is kind of an abnormal curvature of the lens, and it's generally perceived as a static thing, you know, but it's produced by the ciliary muscle which controls the lens, and you get any kind of spasm or anything in that, and you can get some distortion. So I don't personally think that astigmatism needs to be static, and particularly in kids. But, you know, the bottom line, look at function. if your child appears to be able to see well, I mean, if you get, this doesn't take a genius, You show them a little thing up close and see if they can see it, and you show them a little thing at distance and see if they can see it. And if they can probably see.
He doesn't want to wear his glasses.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Our 9-year-old, she'll be 10, when we had her eyes tested, it was like she was only using one. But she could do either one, just not both at the same time. So when he did the eye test, we thought she was just playing games. And so he dilated her eyes so that he said she wouldn't be able to play any games with us. And he said that both of her eyes were weakened because she only used one at a time instead of using them both. So she wears glasses. Well, she did it for like 6 months, but she started getting headaches. So does she need glasses or?
Now, you're talking about what we call strabismus, all right, which means child's using one eye and one eye either floats out or goes in. You have a divergent strabismus or a convergent strabismus, and it can be an alternating where one time one eye does it, the other eye does it. I haven't found that glasses help that. Generally, some fairly simple little eye exercises.
Reading fluency problems, like she can read, but she can read
Yeah.
a lot faster if she's wearing her glasses.
Yeah.
I don't know if it just makes her.
Yeah, what they did with the glasses, I'm sure, is they gave her a bit of a plus lens, a bit of a magnifier, and they might have put what are called prisms in to kind of change the direction so that the eyes kind of are going somewhere else. But it doesn't really, in my experience, fix the problem.
Yeah, I mean, could she just, if she worked on it, focus and change her eyes to where they wouldn't do that anymore?
Well, generally, think of it in terms of it's really a fine motor problem. It's a matter of coordinating the ocular muscles to work well. And again, generally, some simple exercises can help that. Are there kids who need glasses? Absolutely, but for an awful lot of kids, I think they're significantly overprescribed. And bottom line, you want to look at what works, If your child does better without them, don't wear them. If they do better with them, think about it.
Well, she's 10, so it depends on the day.
Yeah. So any visual issues, be it acuity issues or tracking issues or convergence issues like your daughter's, any of those things to some degree can make learning more difficult than it should be. Okay. And you want to know what you're dealing with. I mean, if you have a child who is, significantly myopic and can't see the blackboard, that's going to be a problem, and you need to do something about it. But you need to be aware, of what's going on there, and then make your, a knowledgeable decision about what you want to do to try to fix it. Okay? Probably for every visual problem, we've got 10 auditory problems. And unfortunately, most of the auditory problems are never identified. I think the biggest problem we have in American education today are problems that are reflections of auditory issues. And we almost have an epidemic of them. The primary cause of most of the auditory issues is a little thing called fluid in the middle ear, or otis media. Okay? Huge numbers of kids have chronic fluid in the middle ear, particularly from birth up to about 6 or 7 years. Virtually never is it identified. Your pediatrician typically will go in and check ears looking for ear infections. The pediatrician typically will not do the tests necessary to identify fluid problems. Even to the point your child may have an ear infection, they'll put them on antibiotics, look in and the ear infection's gone, and they say, we're fine. Well, you can have, and generally do have, fluid issues without infection. The brain has to learn how to process specific frequencies of sound. Most of that processing occurs in the first 2 years of life. That processing is very frequency specific. All right, it is so frequency specific that the reason most of us have difficulty ever learning a foreign language or learning how to speak it well without an accent is we literally cannot hear them. And we can't hear them because different languages emphasize different frequencies of sound. And in your first few years of life, if you haven't been exposed to those frequencies, your brain doesn't learn how to process those frequencies. The most glaring example is in Japanese, there's no R sound. And you can bring in a whole bunch of native Japanese and line them up and have them all say rice, and they all say lice. And you can do it every day for the next year, and they're still going to be saying lice, because they literally cannot hear that sound. Okay. The human ear processes sounds from 20 hertz to 20,000, okay? And if you go get a hearing test, they will test 6 or 8 frequencies out of 20,000. Okay? Guess how good that is. All right. I mean, it'll tell you if you're deaf or close to it. All right, but it really cannot tell you how well your child hears. Yes, ma'am?
So I have a question on this then. I have a 6-month-old, and I live in a 2-language home. My husband is Asian, and his mother-in-law is living with us, and so my daughter hears English and my husband's language all day long. Is that going to make her hearing, from what I'm hearing from you, is that going to make her hear more frequencies?
It is.
Someone that, so in that way, perception is good.
That's good.
Okay. Because we often wonder if this is okay that my daughter's hearing both of these languages, but my mother-in-law does not speak English very well. So she's with my daughter all day long. And then my husband and I are with her the rest of the time, and so we want to know if this is really okay.
Yeah, just so you know, typically in a bilingual or trilingual home, language is a little delayed generally for the first 3 years, but after 3 years, everything kicks in and you're off and running with 2 or 3 languages.
Okay.
So it's a good thing.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, actually what we do, you know, with young children who we want to, you know, really put their pieces together is we expose them, you know, to audio tapes and things of all kinds of languages. Just, you know, they don't have to understand what's on them. They just have to hear the frequencies. Right. My experience has been any period in which a child has fluid in the middle ear, auditory development stops. All right, and that means not only the ability to process tones stops, language development tends to stop. All right, and we have a huge global developmental problem. Matter of fact, it's such a huge problem. The children who come to us labeled as simply having a developmental delay. Understand, you get labeled as having a developmental delay if you take your child to the doctors and they do all the testing they can think of, can't find anything broken, but your 6-year-old acts like he's 3. Okay. Then you get the label of being developmentally delayed. Virtually every child I have ever seen with that label, if we looked, we found we had problems with those ears. To put that also in further perspective, in treating Down syndrome children, because of the positioning of their ears and their eustachian tubes, it is the #1 with a close second problem in terms of their development and language function. The #1 cause of the fluid is sadly dairy products. In fact, I have a friend who was an ENT, and after a number of years, I finally talked him into pulling kids off dairy products who had chronic congestion and ear problems, and 75% of the kids never had a problem again. Yeah. That's pretty significant. So, #1, I look at dairy products. If the fluid is there and you just, you know, changing diet, you can't get rid of it, it generally means tubes. And often the kids need the tubes in there, you know, for an extended period of time. And the process of putting the tubes in is a pretty easy deal. But you do not want to keep fluid in there. You know, and to give you even the bigger picture there, the fluid is in the middle ear, and the pressure from the inner ear, from the middle ear, puts pressure on the inner ear. Your inner ear is your vestibular system, your balance mechanism. So often the kids with these fluid problems, we not only have delay in their auditory language development, we have delays in their motor development because their balance is knocked off. And to make it even a little worse, relative to your child, the vestibular system helps direct the ocular muscles. So often with fluid problems, we see strabismus problems. And typically what you want to do is go to an ENT, ear, nose, and throat doctor, and get a tympanogram done. Simple test, and it'll tell you if there's fluid. And generally when we have families start on programs, if we have questions about fluid, we ask the family to get a baseline of tests, which means we have them go in like every 2 weeks for 2 months to see if those ears are clear. Yes, ma'am?
Does a child that passes a hearing test perfectly, would they still have, is it still possible that they could have fluid in their hearing?
6 or 8 frequencies out of 20,000.
So very possibly.
Absolutely.
So a basic hearing test versus a tympanogram they're totally different things.
Totally different things. The tympanogram test for fluid, hearing test, as I say, tests 6 to 8 frequencies out of 20,000. Sir?
What range of ages is this affecting children, or adults? How broad is that range?
Typically, by the time kids are 6 to 8, we've had enough physical growth that we don't see the problem a lot. Essentially what happens is at birth, the eustachian tubes are almost horizontal. And as the child grows, they become more vertical and they get larger from the growth so that the fluid drains better. So, it's generally at its worst from birth up until, 5 or 6. But it can continue, whenever. And generally, if your child's congested, there's fluid in the middle ear.
So if the fluid was there and they're 10 or 12 years old now, then is the remedial work you do at that point?
Yep. And actually, when I first started in this work and became aware of these auditory issues, it was horrendous because we knew we had a problem. We had no tools to fix it. And fortunately, in the last 15 years, there's been the development of various forms of auditory training that retrain the brain to process sound. We now use something called the listening program, which is a home-based program to re-educate the brain to process the sound, and it's a very painless process. The kid essentially listens to treated music for 15 minutes a day, and works well. Yeah. So you do, as I say, auditory issues, and you'll see more as we continue through the evening, are hugely important. All right, and something. If we've got the problem, we need to identify it and we need to fix it. Yeah. And relative to hearing, we have, number one, auditory tonal processing problems. Can we hear the tones? All right, if we have a problem with that, we use primarily the listening program. And a very few kids, we have a problem with the brain processing the tones fast enough, which means the child will hear the first part of a word and not be able to process that tone to process the next tone rapidly enough. There's a program called Fast Forward that addresses that, but that's a rare problem. That's 1 in 1,000 kids with auditory problems maybe has that issue. Let's assume that the brain is getting good quality information auditorily and visually. If it does, then what happens is the brain learns to process auditory and visual information sequentially. It's called sequential processing. And this is a big deal. And it's such a big deal that we're going to let you check your auditory processing here, okay? All right, what we're going to do here is a simple little test to get an idea how well you process auditory information, okay? And what I'm going to do is simply read you sequences of numbers. I'm going to want you to listen to each sequence and then write it down. Okay? Do not write as I read. Okay? Listen to the entire sequence and then write it down. Okay? I'm going to take a few deep breaths, relax. Even though this is a test, but we won't ask you to share the results, okay? All right. Ready? First one, letter A, 973. Write that down. B, 1406. C, 39418. D, 067285. Some of you look concerned. Okay, E, 3516927. F, 583912004. And please keep your eyes on your own papers. G, 764580129. H, 21640895773. Almost done. I, 4, 5, 3, 8, 2, 1, 7, 0, 3, 6, 9. Okay, this is your last chance. Okay. J, 8, 7, 0, 3, 9, 2, 6, 1, 4, 2, 8, 0.
Now, does speed have something to do with that? If you were rattling them off faster, I think I would be able to.
If I was saying them faster, it would be easier, but it would not be properly
Okay.
testing your auditory processing. Generally, auditory sequential processing develops at the rate of 1 piece per year. Okay, which means your 1-year-old should be able to process 1 piece. For your 1-year-old, that would be like able to follow a direction, like we say, wave bye-bye, and they can do that. That's a 1. Your 2-year-old should be able to do 2 pieces. So your 2-year-old should be able to process a direction like touch your nose and your eye. Okay. Your 3-year-old should sequence 3 pieces. Your 4-year-old, 4 pieces. Your 5-year-old, 5 pieces. Your 6-year-old, 6 pieces. Your 7-year-old, 7 pieces. Have we passed you yet? Okay, normal sequential processing for an adult is generally considered 7 plus or minus 2 digits. So a range of 5 to 9. I've been working with sequential processing for 30 years, and I can tell you if your processing is below a 7, you need help. Okay. We have an international project that we're doing. It's called the Simply Smarter Project 9 plus or minus 2. Right? And anyone can go online to our site and can check their auditory and visual processing. And essentially what our project is, it's an international project where we, number one, want to test, hopefully, something like 1 million people and establish new baselines relative to where people's processing skills are. And then we want to raise that norm up to 9 plus or minus 2. Because we really have found if you're functioning below a 7, you are not coming close to utilizing or achieving your innate potential. And those people who are functioning around 5, adults who are 5s, often are in serious trouble. We've gone out and our researchers have tested people in underprivileged areas around the planet. And we find that the typical auditory processing is something closer to a 4. Now think about that, all right? That's saying we've got areas in this world where the adults, the people who are supposed to be raising children, who are supposed to be taking care of families, contributing to the society, have the processing abilities and the neurological maturity of a typical 4-year-old child. Okay. Going into prison systems, I find the average is about a 5. Okay. And the reality of that is we can continue to put people in prison who can't function in the society and let them back out and they'll be right back in again, because unless we develop these basic skills, they're not going to be able to function within the society. Yes, ma'am.
How difficult is it to develop those skills? Like, is it quite a bit different for a child level to develop it than an adult level to develop those skills?
For young children, we've got a whole slew of different activities we do. In fact, if you go onto the project site, it actually, you can watch little video clips of how to do some activities. It's pretty simple, and they're mostly game kind of things you can do with young kids. For older kids and adults, there's software that does it pretty painlessly. So it's not hard to do. We generally find that we can, without stressing anybody out, raise most people up 2 digits in a year. All right, which is pretty significant, because we can take someone from the bottom and get them up to an average level, or take an average person and get them up to the high end. And to also put this in perspective, we have individuals that we work with whose processing is up in the high teens. Okay. And you get kids functioning at that level, and they can do virtually anything. right? You know, I mentioned, you know, I have this one girl who, you know, was in the upper teens and she learned calculus one day. Okay. All right. You know, this, by the way, was a child who at 8, when she came to us, was labeled as having a learning disability and attention deficit hyperactive problem as well at 8. And we sent her to one of the best colleges in the country when she was 14. Okay. And she got her bachelor's degree in mathematical biology and got a full scholarship to Columbia after that. She also, by the way, was a child who had an APGAR of 1, for those of you who know what an APGAR is. So a kid who was brain injured from birth, who now has, you know, is working on her second master's degree. She works for the Defense Department and can't tell me what she does. She's a concert violinist, concert singer, and she just sent me a record that she's producing, where she's singing and wrote all the music and the whole deal. Well, not bad. No, not bad. So processing, if you work at it, is not difficult to change. And as our kids learn, and as our families learn, they work on processing first and curriculum last. Okay, and we'll have kids who would come in and, you know, when we're seeing them after 3 months, and they've had like a busy summer, they did no academics over the summer, but they worked on their processing, and they come back and are functioning a year higher, having done no academics in the summer, all right, just because their processing is increased. All right. So it's a big deal. It's a very, very big deal. All right. So if you do nothing else, work on your processing skills. Yes?
Now, these activities and things, you learn about them on your website?
There's some information on the website, yeah. And, you know, we probably have, what, 40 different processing activities we use, something like that, depending on the age, the level of development of the child, and where they are with their processing. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about receiving information, processing information, storing information. We go back to the dominance. If you have an auditory dominance problem, you've got an auditory long-term memory problem. Visual dominance problem, visual long-term memory problems. Okay? So storage and dominance is a big issue. And then utilize information. And to utilize information, we talk about the general organization of the central nervous system. And again, if you have a dominant hemisphere, you're not only putting information where it belongs, you have access to it. You can function logically, analytically, you don't function emotionally. You need to put all those pieces together. A big part of what's significant in the educational process relative to both learning and attention issues has to do with a big factor, which is the intensity of input. Ultimately, the individual receiving the input determines the intensity of the input. Okay, as an example, there's a few of you in here for whom I'm saying things that you feel directly apply to your child. For you, the intensity, hopefully, of this input is fairly high. There's others in you who are receiving the same stuff, but you're not seeing the correlations, it's not pushing your buttons, and for you, the intensity is low, okay? You're both getting the same stuff, but you ultimately determine the intensity of the input, okay? So in any educational environment, your child determines the intensity of the input. Now, if you look at intensity and rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, we generally say if something goes in with an intensity of 9 or 10, learning is instantaneous. If the intensity is a 7 or 8, learning occurs with very few frequencies of the input. If the intensity is 5 or 6, learning ultimately happens with a lot of frequency of the input. And if you get much below a 5, not much goes in. Okay? So if your child's sitting in class and he's a 4 in terms of his intensity, you can pretty well assume not much of anything's going to get into his long-term memory. Okay? Intensity is huge.
Can you define a 10 versus a 1 on that scale?
Yeah, I use my best example of a 10 is imagine on your way here tonight, on the freeway there was an accident. And imagine when, those cars hit right in front of you, and imagine you saw someone's head fly through the air. Okay? That's a 10. Okay? Think about it. If you had that experience, it would take an instant, and you would remember it the rest of your life. Okay? That's high intensity. If you're lucky, you can remember being in school and having a teacher and maybe 2 teachers who knew how to push your buttons and get you going, and you remember actually some things you learned in those classes because the intensity was high.
Is intensity equal to excitement?
Yes and no, which is one of our problems today. Ultimately, as I say, the child determines the level of intensity of the input. But if you create things with a lot of innate intensity, like some movies, video games, right, those things have innate intensity, and the child can respond with intensity to those things, right? Which is why, for example, you have a kid who can't stay awake in school who can play video games all night, right? Because the intensity of the game creates some intensity in the kid. But where that leads us into problems is those kids often don't learn how to generate their own intensity. Okay? So you put them in a learning environment, a normal environment, and they cannot create and maintain intensity. Okay? It's a huge part of attention issues. Right? By the way, another huge part of attention issues, going through history forms of kids who are come to us diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, like 90+% of those kids on the history, the parent checks off that the child's hypersensitive to sound. Okay, so the auditory tonal processing problems are huge with that population of kids. Right. So there's a lot of things that we tend to do to destroy intensity. Right? So with young kids doing too many things like, too much TV, too many video games, that's a problem. Right? By the way, on the data that we're collecting on our Project 9+or-2, something has shown up that's quite interesting, and that is across the board from young children to older adults, we see a drop in sequential processing with everyone who watches TV more than an hour a day. I mean, it's across the board. Another great thing that destroys intensity is a little thing called curriculum. Curriculum, what they're supposedly teaching you at school. Have any of you ever heard the saying that on graduation day, most graduates have already forgotten 99% of what they learned in the preceding 12 years? That's probably true. Yeah. The way the system is designed, an attempt to teach everyone something. All right, we have curriculum. And essentially a curriculum says, this is what we teach today, this is what we teach this week, this is what we teach this month, this is what we teach this quarter, this is what we teach this year. Right? Regardless of what the child is interested in. Okay? And essentially the curriculum teaches to the point where you have the information where something could start to become interesting. And typically that's where you stop and you move on to the next thing. I can remember in 9th grade, we started studying rocks and minerals, and wow, I thought that, was really interesting stuff. And at the point where they really piqued my interest, and I said, now I can really get into this, time to move on and talk about something else, okay? And that's what curriculum is. Remember that little thing, the further we get from one to one, the less efficient it becomes, okay? That's the problem with curriculum. Because the curriculum doesn't care if you like it or not. Curriculum doesn't care if you want to learn more about it or not. Okay? That's a problem. All right? So the very structure of how we're running schools tends to destroy kids' basic intensity.
Is your program a component for homeschooling?
About 75% of our families think today homeschool. It's great for many. It's not appropriate for some. It's impossible for others. A lot of kids with learning type problems and attention type problems, if the family can, they'll often pull the kids out of school until we, if you will, fix them and then put them back in again. It quite honestly is a lot easier. All right? Because another part of the problem with intensity is as you increase duration, you decrease intensity. Okay? As bad as the curriculum generally is for the kids' intensity, homework makes it even worse. Let's send the kids for 6 hours and bore them to death, and then let's give them a few more hours to do at home to teach them to really love learning. Okay? And if you think about, two of the biggest problems I talk about with our kids today is kids don't read. And think about it, how many kids have any time left to learn how to love to read? All right, between what they have to do at school and what they have to do for homework. And the other big thing we're talking about is our kids don't get enough exercise. Well, when in the world are they supposed to get any exercise? Okay? Yes?
How about socializing? How does that, by improving the sequential processing, will that help with socializing too?
Universally, kids with auditory processing problems have social problems, okay? Unless they get involved with a group you'd rather they not be involved with, okay? The basis of social interaction is communication. The basis of communication is auditory processing, okay? You've got to be able to process what the other person is saying. Then you've got to be able to understand what the other person is saying, and then you have to be able to form your words and your thoughts and communicate them. So the basis of communication is, in fact, largely auditory sequential processing. Sir?
How does personality affect the ability of the child to determine the intensity of the input? You can think of various models of personality, be they kinesthetic, auditory, those types of people versus, or even the otter beaver kind of approach.
Yeah. There are certainly individual differences, and how many of them are innately reflections of the child's personality and how much is what the child has learned to be and learned to do, is a question. Bringing up, kinesthetic learners, one of the realities is if you're not a visual learner or an auditory learner, you're in big trouble. You're essentially a huge mess. All right, because it's most of the information you need to take in needs to go in auditorily or visually. And if you got to put your hands on it, that means you've got a real problem with both of those, and the only way you can get any intensity is by doing hands-on stuff. So is it significant? Yeah. But you can increase the sequential processing of anyone, and you potentially can turn anyone on to learning and raise their intensity. And a lot of those kids, regardless of what their personality type is, a lot of them ultimately find that thing that pushes their buttons and turns them on and creates the intensity. But the job really is making sure educationally we're not doing a whole bunch of things to destroy it. And in fact, hopefully doing things to find those things early on that excite the kids and turn them on to learning.
So do we downplay the kinesthetic characteristics of the personality and focus on the auditory and the visual?
Yeah, I build the auditory and visual as rapidly as I possibly can.
But I like kinesthetic kids. They're great.
Well, yeah, and truth is, if the more hands-on learning we could all do, the better. And if we throw out a bunch of curriculum and give it time to do that, all right. But we want to make sure our kids have strong auditory skills and visual skills, and let them make a choice. Essentially, most of us that function reasonably well are lucky accidents, right? And then there are all the ones who are unlucky accidents, right? And with the state of the art today, in terms of what we know, we don't have to have that. We really have the knowledge to help everyone put their pieces together so that regardless of what the situation is, regardless of whether it's auditory information or visual information, we have the ability to take it in efficiently. We have the ability to process it. We have the ability to store it. We have the ability to utilize it. That really is the job and the goal. And as I say, at this time in the world, we have the knowledge to be able to do that. And, fortunately, it typically isn't that hard to do it. Okay, let's talk about, in your outlines there, we've got a little list of things associated with auditory processing problems. And just to go through that, at the top of that list is distractibility, short attention span. Now, let me talk about those issues. I say, the top of the list of my concerns is auditory processing. And if we look at most of the kids labeled as having attention issues, the vast majority of them have auditory issues. Unless you're crazy or drugged, you only attend to what you can process. Okay? I'll say that again. Unless you're crazy or drugged, you only attend to what you can process. All right? If I were standing up here speaking in Greek, which you couldn't process, you should leave. Right? Well, essentially, you have a child. Let's say you have a child who's 8 years old. He's in a third grade classroom, and he has the processing ability of a 4-year-old. Okay. What's he processing? Not much. All right. What's he attending to? Not much. What's he distracted by? Everything. Okay? As he should be. All right? You attend to what you process. Now, if you said, Bob, I've got a bunch of 2-year-olds and I want to sit them in a second grade class, how can I do that? There's only one way I know you could do that. You drug them all. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
This is something that's kind of strange. I've got a 12-year-old daughter, and, this is kind of strange, but it's like, I'll wash the clothes, and I'll dry them, and I'll fold them, and I'll put them on her bed, and I'll tell her, put your shirts where they go, pants where they go, and everything else where they go. And it's like, I'll look in there, and everything's in one spot. And it's like, why does she not
Process.
It's like, and I'll tell her, again, it's like, it's still the same thing every time.
Yeah, let me take that a step further. We checked your auditory sequential processing with those data spans. That actually tested your, what we call auditory short-term memory. Okay, pretty much straight in and straight out. What's actually more important than that is your auditory working memory, and that gets more into a reverse digit span, which would be how many numbers could you listen to and repeat backwards, okay? Because that's essentially how many pieces can you hold and manipulate. So in terms of your daughter carrying out a job like that, it really is more working memory. So she might have been able to repeat the direction you gave her, but in the process of doing it, not have it in the working memory to be able to do it. Now the classic thing, you tell the kid to go upstairs and do this and that, all right? And you go up 10 minutes later and they're anding upstairs, I mean, no clue what it was you told them to do. And processing, huge deal, huge deal. Okay, behavior problems. When we look at global neurological maturity, the best tool we have to assess that is auditory sequential processing. If I have a 15-year-old who has the processing skills of a 4-year-old, I've got a 15-year-old with the neurological, emotional maturity of a 4-year-old. Okay? It is what it is. And if I want that 15-year-old to act like a 15-year-old, I've got to increase the processing skills. To illustrate that, look, it's easiest to see that with little kids. 1-year-old kids who can process one piece of information are the easiest they'll be in their entire lives, okay? You give a 1-year-old something, they smile and they're happy. You can take it away, they're still smiling and happy, okay? Because they only process one thing, all right? You enjoy that for the first year because then they hit the 2s, all right? And they're not called the terrible 2s for nothing, all right? And they're the terrible 2s because 2-year-olds process 2 pieces. The 2 pieces are typically I want or don't want. End of discussion, okay? They're totally illogical. They don't process a but or a later. It's simply I want or don't want, right? When you get to 3, it changes again. At 3, we get into what we call lock and block behavior, which means the kids can kind of understand what you say, but they kind of depend on their perception of the situation to determine if it's okay or not. So you ask a 3-year-old to do something, and if they think it's fun and non-threatening, great. All right. If they perceive it as therapy or work or threatening in any way, shape, or form, they just lock up on you. I tell people I train, the toughest kid you're ever going to assess is a normal 3-year-old. Because they're going to walk in the door with a parent and take one look at you and know your trouble, and they're not going to do anything. Nothing. Okay? It's not until they're 4 that you can begin to reason with them. Okay? All right. So every step, every piece of this sequential processing is huge, gargantuan in terms of the total function. I watch the news in the morning and listen to all the horrible stuff that happened around here during the course of the night. And if you listen to what goes on, you realize that we've got all these adults processing down there at the 4 and the 5. We've got the judgment, the reasoning of a 4 and 5-year-old. They just happen to be that big, weigh 200 pounds, and carry a gun. Okay? All right. That's scary. That's scary. Okay. Hyperactive. If your 2-year-old isn't hyperactive, they're sick. Okay? If you've got a kid with low processing, they will only attend to things for the length of time a child would who has that correct processing. So if your child's a 5, they're going to attend to something as long as would a typical 5-year-old. Okay? That's how it works, all right? So it's not a matter that they're wired and they're overactive. Their activity level is a reflection of what they can process. You attend to what you can process.
So if a child is fidgety and can't sit still, he can probably be at a 2?
Well, depending on what the range is, but I mean, you try to put a kindergarten child in a second grade classroom, they're going to be fidgety, distractible, hyperactive. Right? You put that 5-year-old in 10th grade, it gets ugly. The processing is huge. Okay, impulsive. Again, the processing determines the global level of neurological maturity. Are little kids impulsive? Absolutely. If you have low processing, are you impulsive? Absolutely. Okay? And then it creates problems with math and reading, following directions, social emotional maturity, language, syntax problems, following multiple step directions. That's pretty much the list of what you do, right? It affects everything. Okay? Huge. If you have visual processing problems, it's not quite as big a deal, but it still is going to create problems with things like math and spelling, reading fluency, visual attention, eye contact, and you also have problems with visual reversals. Speaking of visual reversals, often the fastest way of getting labeled as dyslexic is to have visual reversals. Okay. Visual reversals are a reflection of visual dominance problems. Okay. If you've got a kid who's reading Dog for God, he's got a visual dominance problem. Okay. Visual reversals are visual dominance problem. Nothing mysterious. Fixable. Okay. Do not have a disease. Just using the wrong eye. You can fix that. Okay. The next piece we look at is visualization and conceptualization. Now, before I tell you what those are exactly, I want to shake you up a little bit. With the exception of one individual in the room, it looks like everyone in here has completed their formal education. Okay? And I suspect many of you have done college and probably graduate work. A lot of years of education. Now, if there's two primary ways to learn, which is auditorily and visually, you might think somewhere along the line you might have learned how well you can do those things. I mean, you spend lots of time in classes and lots of time studying. I mean, it's not like there's 50 billion different important pieces. I mean, it's primarily how you take in visual information and auditory information. It's a little sad that you never found out how well you did that. And then when you think, there's only two basic ways to think. One's in pictures, we call that visualization. The other's in words, and we call that conceptualization. So how many of you in all your years of education learned how well you think? Maybe none. How sad is that? How screwy is our system that we can take people entirely through the educational process without finding out how they learn and if they've got any issues with those things, and how they think and if they have any issues with those things. Yeah. I mean, is it a wonder our educational system's a mess? All right. To be able to function well, you want to be able to visualize well and conceptualize well. Think well in pictures, think well in words. You'll find a lot of your kids with auditory processing problems have difficulty with conceptualization, thinking in words. One of the things you can do, excuse me, to get a feel for how well they do those. If you watch your kids' eye gaze when they're thinking or communicating, you can get a bit of a feel for what's going on in their heads. For the most part, if you ask Johnny a question and you see his eyes go up and to the side, he's visualizing. And if you see them go down and to the side, he's conceptualizing, thinking in words. If you see the eyes going up and down, he's having a problem thinking, period. Okay?
What about the blink glossy stare? That's my 4-year-old.
You're probably constructing sentences for someone who processes 7 and probably a 2. So you may as well speak Greek. Okay? Yeah. Doesn't get it. Okay? But to function well and to function efficiently, to learn well, you really want to be able to visualize well and conceptualize well. Another way you can kind of test your kids with this, give them mental math to do. Okay. As an example, how much is 67 plus 85? Raise your hand when you have the answer. Keep it up. Keep your hands up once you get the answer. Some of those eyes are still going up and down. Okay, it's long enough to suffer. Now, generally the first hands go up with strong visualizers. Strong visualizer pictured those numbers, 67, 85, added them like they're written down in front of them. Okay. Then we add the pretty strong conceptualizers. All right? And they figured it out in words. 75 is 12, carry the 1, 150. Okay? Then we had the people whose hands never got up because they got the picture, lost the picture, couldn't remember the words, got the picture, lost the picture, and eventually you forgot what the numbers were. Right? So you really want to be able to do both of those things well to be able to think efficiently and to function well. Okay? Again, they're pieces we want to check with our kids and make sure they work, and if they don't work, we want to develop them. Unfortunately, most of this stuff is not all that hard to develop. We just have to be cognizant of it. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of interesting because you mentioned conceptualization. I've actually had numerous tests with my oldest daughter. She was real low on conceptualization. They said she's like first grade level. And she was like 10. It's like, I've been doing tutoring, I've done learning techniques, I've done it all. You know? And it's like, am I wasting my time?
Yeah.
Doing those types of things?
Generally.
I mean, she's got spelling difficulties, she's got some memory issues. It's like,
You got to fix what's broken. You know, when I first got in this field, I was a psych major. And I did internships with a lot of different folks, and one was a clinical psychologist. And I spent a lot of time with her going through complete psychological workups. And the workups then are like the workups now. You know, you can spend literally thousands of dollars on a comprehensive workup. It'll produce a document that's maybe a half-inch thick. They might give your child a few labels, may have thousands of scores, and at the end of it, the shortest part is on the last page, and generally it's a paragraph, and that's called recommendations. Okay? And generally the recommendations are something like, put your kid in special ed, and bring him back next year so we can do this again. Okay? The only reason to make an assessment is to determine what's broken so you know what to fix. Right? And again, part of what's going on with our system is the perception is, let's figure out what we have to call the kid. Let's give him his label, let's give him the classification, and wish him luck. Yeah. You've got to identify what's broken only for the purpose of fixing it. Okay. And as I said, most of these things are not difficult to fix once you identify what's broken. If we look at the causes of learning and attention problems, we have the developmental problems, which kids, are missing developmental steps. Lack of opportunity because parents didn't know what opportunities they need to provide. Physical problems that got in the way. Physical problems like everything from the middle ear fluid we talked about to a kid breaks his leg when he's 1 and isn't able to move around, and that losses up the developmental process. Or to kids who are in daycare all day and restricted from movement on the floor, receiving minimal amount of individual attention. Lots of things can create a problem. Also, part of the problem becomes if we slow the process down for any reason, we develop imbalances. For example, with kids with significant developmental problems, one of our biggest issues becomes they become too strong at the wrong things. One of the most common is all children start off life being visualizers, okay? They only think in pictures because they don't have language. They can't think in words. If development occurs at a normal pace, that auditory kicks in, language starts kicking in at an early age, and you end up by the time the kids are about 6 with a pretty good balance between visualization and conceptualization. Slow that process down so that the auditory doesn't develop. The kids become too good at visualization. Okay? We have kids who are so good at visualization, they can watch a video once and they get the whole thing memorized. Okay? If you become too good at something, then it's very difficult to bring in the other part. Okay, when the child is a very, very strong visualizer, it's tough to develop the auditory processing and conceptualization. Okay. So the normal process of development, the normal pace of development is a big deal. Slow it down, we create imbalances, and we have some things that are too good, some things that are too weak, and we've got to identify those and address those and fix those. Then we have all the physiological problems. Sadly, one of the bigger issues and tougher issues is diet, nutrition. We got an awful lot of kids with absolutely horrendous diets. And one of the things that amazes me is, in the same schools where they're passing out the Ritalin, they've got the candy machine and the pop machine, and what they serve at lunch is awful. Let's wire the kids, with sugar and colorings, and then let's drug them to try to balance it out a little bit. Okay. Everything that goes on physiologically affects your neurological function. We could try to pretend that our diet doesn't affect our brains, our sleep doesn't affect our brains, exercise doesn't affect our brains. But truth is, all those things affect our brains. If you have a child with a learning issue or an attention issue, one of the things you want to put high on your list is diet and nutrition. In general, just a general diet for any kid, limit dairy, limit wheat, and as much as you possibly can, eliminate sugar, artificial colorings, and artificial sweeteners. And as all the nutritionists will tell you, when you go to the grocery store, just walk around the outside and stay out of the aisles. Okay? Meats, fruits, and vegetables. Okay. It's not that complicated. Okay. But you know, if you want to feed your kids garbage, don't complain about their activity level and their lack of attention. Okay.
When you develop these programs, do you develop a diet for
Part of the process we go through is when we do an initial profile on the child, we identify a lot of things and we start working on them, and it kind of is like layers, okay? And initially we'll make general dietary recommendations. If we get into it and we're finding we're not seeing neurological change that we would expect, then we'll look harder at specific physiological issues and dietary issues and make recommendations based on that.
how long do you give the diet changes? Because with some with autism, and so I've heard lots about diet, and some you'll see changes instantly, and some they think that it takes 6 months for your body to detoxify things.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it really depends on the child. When you get into things like autism, it's a significantly bigger deal than it is for the, you know, the kids with the learning problems. But you've got to look at it individually. The greater the general neurological problem, the more significant the physiological piece. You know, if you've got a gifted, accelerated kid who's a delight, you know, don't go messing with their diet a bunch. Okay. You know, you've got a kid who's a mess. We want to cover every piece we can as well as we possibly can address it. So if it's not broken, you don't need to fix it, but if it's broken, you need to do everything you can to fix it. Okay. I suppose it's necessary in any discussion of learning problems and attention problems to say something about medication. Particularly since we have about 2.5 million of our kids in the country who are being medicated. You know, to my perception, it's a gargantuan problem. There is not a drug that addresses the causes of learning or attention problems. Okay. Now, as I said, you know, if you had a bunch of 2-year-olds you wanted sitting quietly in a second grade classroom, you'd have to drug them. All right. And that's essentially what we're doing with most of the kids. And anyone who can pretend that there's not negative side effects of these drugs is kidding themselves. You know, the Ritalins and such actually slow down brain function as much as 30%. Cut down cerebral blood flow, oxygenation of the brain, all right, particularly in the frontal lobes. You know, ever watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Okay? You know, the big operation in that was a frontal lobotomy, all right? Well, to a degree, the drugs do the same thing. They slow down the brain function. Now, why does that work? Because the lower the processing, the lower the global neurological maturity, the greater the distractedness, the greater the activity level, the more impulsive you are. Okay? That comes with that territory. If we medicate them, we're not fixing those problems. We're just drugging a child who neurologically is immature. So they're not so distracted. Okay? It's masking the problem. It's not addressing and fixing the problem. When we are trying to fix the problems, the more medications the kids are on, the more difficult it is because their brains are being slowed down. You know, it's a hard thing for a parent who has a child who can't function in a classroom and puts them on medication and they can function in the classroom. You know, it works. Well, does it? Okay. You know, I would encourage parents to address it by finding the causes and treating the causes. So enough said. We could spend the night on medications and I don't think any of us want to go there, do we? Part of the problem with the attention and the distractibility and the focus and impulsiveness is what the brain has learned. Now, I talked about sequential processing normally develops until about 7 to 9 years of age, and then without intervention, it stops. Part of what happens there, well, let me demonstrate it. I'm going to start giving you a sequence of numbers, all right? Just like I did in that previous test. And this time, when your brain stops processing the numbers, raise your hand, okay? Which means at the point at which it all starts falling apart, raise your hand, okay? Fair enough? All right, are you ready? I'm going to give you that J again. That's a good one. 8, 7, 0, 3, 9, 2, 6, 1, 4, 2, 8, 0. Okay, we got a lot of hands. All right. Now, generally what happens there is, let's say your digit span was a 7. Somewhere around 8 or 9, you started to crash and burn, okay? And your brain learned, okay, your brain has learned essentially where you can process. And when you go a step or two beyond that, your brain learns, bye, I'm going somewhere else, okay? And whether or not you're listening to a bunch of digits or you're listening to a lecture or whatever, your brain stops processing at a point. Okay? So our kids who have these processing problems, their brain learns when to quit. Right? And unfortunately in the classroom, that's the majority of time. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Our son in junior high said, Mom, it sounds like a teacher's talking in a different language.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because the point, you just felt how it feels when it falls apart. That's what happens. And the kids hate that. I mean, they really hate that. And they often learn, I'm just not going to participate in this.
Can it be localized to a specific topic or subject?
Sure.
I just wonder, because I know in my own personal experience, I did very well in school. I don't mean to brag, but I did very well in school. But I remember in 7th grade when math for me just stopped. And I struggled so hard to just pass, and even through college and even through graduate school, anytime math came up, when it was not simple math that I learned in elementary school, or, I can do budgeting, that simple kind of math, but anything algebra, geometry on, it just stopped. And I had to struggle hard just to get the grades to pass the classes. And even still, I'm married to a math teacher, and he'll bring up something, honey, what's a parabola?
Yeah. Let me talk about math for a minute. Because almost universally, schools do a horrendous job of teaching math.
That's what my husband says too. He's not from this country, and the teaching curriculum that he's had here, that he's been given here as a teacher here, he thinks is horrible.
A big part of the problem with math is a visual process, okay? Meaning it's a matter of steps, and if you can visualize the steps, you can do the process, okay? And how does virtually every teacher teach math? They're up on a blackboard, they're writing a problem, and they're talking non-stop, okay? And the kids are trying to understand what they're saying, but because they don't have digit spans of 20, okay, they can't process those 2,000 words the teacher just used to describe long division. And because they're working so hard to process what the teacher's saying, they can't see it. If the kids knew what was going on in the brain, they'd say, would you please shut up so I can see it? Okay. And you'd be amazed, a parent, you want to teach your child a math process? rapidly work problems in front of them and don't say a thing. It's not hard, okay? But again, not only do we not typically find out how the kids learn and find out their inefficiencies, we even haven't gone to the step to look at what we're teaching and teach it in a way that makes sense. By the way, I have an old friend who is here, and her husband was president of BYU in Hawaii. And a number of years ago, they brought me out to lecture there. And we had a lunch break, and I had a young student who was ushering me around. And as we were sitting down to lunch, and was sitting down with Alton, her husband, who was the president of the college, and the vice president of the college, this kid asked me a question I'd rather she not ask. She said, "Bob, how would you teach a college class?" And I told her, the reality is, the real purpose of teaching a class is to teach something. And if you've in fact taught something, the student will leave the class with that something and retain it for at least months, preferably years. And if that doesn't happen, you haven't done anything. And I said, therefore, if I'm teaching a college class, on the first day, I would give the class a printed list of the few pieces of information I would want them to retain and take away from the course. And I would tell them, on the last day of class, I'll test you on that short list. And then I'd spend the entire semester turning them on to the subject. Okay? Well, Alton, the president of the class, turned to his vice president, and I don't remember what his name was, but George, he said, "What do you think of that?" And George said, "I think that's nonsense." Matter of fact, George said, "I expect my students to learn everything I teach in my classes." Everything. He said, everything from the text, the notes, my lectures. And Alton said to him, "Well, when you test them, do you test them on the important stuff?" And he said, "Absolutely not. Because my good students know they're responsible for the most trivial piece of information." And then he asked, I asked the vice president what it was he taught, and it was something ridiculous, like ancient Japanese history. What did he really think the students were going to take away from that class, in no few years, It's such nonsense, okay? All right. Yeah, there's such a long list of what we do wrong educationally, it's hard to know where to start. Yes, ma'am?
Can you help me understand what causes impulsiveness?
Yeah. You're impulsive primarily because of processing, all right? If you can only think in so many pieces, when you run out of pieces, you stop thinking. All right, so if that processing is really low, you're impulsive because you can't think things through to a conclusion. Okay.
So when he runs into the classroom and shoves another child, he's processing that he needs to be the first one back to his desk.
And end of discussion. Absolutely right.
So to be disciplined for that action means nothing to him.
Correct.
So how do you help him to
You
overcome that?
build his process.
Okay. And that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because one of the saddest parts of all of this to a parent is that when a child has a struggle with learning, begins to fall behind, loses his confidence, becomes impulsive, socially struggles, and his whole person becomes deflated and he kind of loses himself.
And is it, how much of a surprise is it, these kids become suicidal?
And to start rebuilding, there's hope, even in the teens.
Oh, yeah. Personally, when I was a kid in school, they wouldn't have had enough labels for me. And a number of years ago, I had quadruple bypasses. And they slipped me in at the end of the day, which I discovered was not a good thing to do. And I came out of anesthesia at about 9 o'clock in the evening which is not a good thing because the doctors don't show up until about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. So I had a big tube down my throat, and I was wide awake, and I'm gesturing to nurses to come save me, kind of thing, right? And I had this male nurse, who was one of the ugliest people I've ever seen, come over me and said, "If you touch that, we'll strap you down." Okay. So fortunately, I had studied hypnosis and used self-hypnosis to survive the night. But the other thing that helped me through the night was somewhere probably around 1 or 2 a.m., it occurred to me that this wasn't quite as bad as school. Okay? That's how much I enjoyed the process. So yeah, you know, the kids who have these learning issues, you know, it's horrendous because it's attacking everything they are. So let's kind of sum up here. To organize the brain, to get the kids functioning properly, we want to talk about going back and identifying any disorganization in the brain, and correcting that. We want to develop the ability to process information. We want to establish dominance so we get storage and long-term memory. We want to bring academic function up, and to put that in perspective, generally kids who get A's and B's in school test out 2 grade levels or above placement. Okay? Now think about that for a minute. Kids who get A's and B's generally are functioning a couple of grades above placement. Okay? What that means is the kids who do well are the kids who don't have to learn anything in the class. All the kids who have to learn something in class are in trouble.
What do you see whenever your child goes from A's and B's last semester to this semester's report cards, D's and F's?
They go from A's and B's to D's and F's.
Like in the 2-month period.
Something turned them off. Yeah, a lot of opportunities there. Yeah. Generally, when we're working at picking up all the developmental pieces at the same time, we work to accelerate the academic function. And where we want to have the kids is testing out 2 grade levels above placement. So if your child's in 6th grade, we want them testing out at least 8th grade level, okay, before we can say they're ready to be off and running, because we want them to be successful. Okay. On occasion, after we've put the developmental pieces together and the processing pieces together, we still have some issue with focus and attention because the brain hasn't learned that it's processing better yet. You know, so for example, if your child was a 5 in terms of the processing for a bunch of years and we get it up to a 7 or an 8 or a 9, their brain may still be shutting down when the input passes a 5, okay? And that's not many of them, but when that does exist, we've got a new tool. It's a system called Play Attention. It's kind of like neurofeedback, but not. It utilizes biofeedback techniques, but essentially what the child does is work through cognitive functions using the biofeedback techniques, which is a whole lot more successful. But, you know, that's a tool that we have. Fortunately, it's not a tool that we need a lot. And then turning the kid on to learning is the biggie. So, yeah.
Do you ever run into students who have the type of ADD that's often called over-focused ADD that can't switch attention, and which often comes up in many men in, I hate to say this, but pornography, sexaholics, anonymous groups are there with ADD problems. Therapists have told me that almost 80% of those groups have ADD problems.
It's like 3 and 4-year-olds, okay? You know, your 3 and 4-year-olds get stuck on things, all right? And they perseverate with things, and they become addicted to things, okay? Same deal.
So that's fixable.
Yep. Yep. Okay. So, I hope I've given you some information so you get some insights into your kids. Essentially what we do is create individualized programs. The programs we design are to fit what's broken in the kids. The program is designed to be implemented primarily by parents. We design the program around the realities of school, parents' time. We use what we've got. All right. In terms of what we do, to put things in perspective, we perceive learning and attention problems as the easiest things we have to fix. Okay? When you spend big parts of your day working with severely autistic kids and kids with severe brain injuries, these are, in fact, the easy kids. And our expectation is typically these kinds of kids are pretty quick fixes. And we expect to get them off and running in a short period of time. We typically see kids once every 3 months, at which point we do our evaluation with the parents, then we design the program, then we actually produce a DVD that demonstrates the various activities that we want the child to do with recommended frequencies and durations. Do this many times, this many minutes a day. So it's very specific. A month after starting program, we have the family videotape the child doing the program. We review the videotapes and then consult with the parents and make modifications on program. We have staff who spend all day, every day, talking to the parents on program and assisting them. We constantly modify the program based on the needs. All right, so it's a lot of interaction, as much interaction as the family needs, and we encourage generally more than we even get. Because generally, the better the communication, the better we do. We can modify program, once a week if we need to. Our perception is all these things are fixable, and unless we've got some severe physiological issue that can't be identified, they are fixable. We also have a message board for our families, so not only are you communicating with all our staff, you're communicating with other families on program. We have a medical director, we have a nutritional director, we have developmentalists, we have therapists, we've got a whole team that essentially combine knowledge and skills and experience to put together the programs. Yeah. As parents, please understand that your kids, if they have issues, if you understand their issues and address their issues, you should be able to fix their issues. Don't accept labels and say, oh dear, I've got a child who's this or that, and he's condemned to that for life. Okay? And also understand that as parents, you know your kids better than anybody else. You are the experts on your kids. And generally as parents, if you can get some help and assistance and expertise so you can use your understanding and knowledge and love of your kids, you can fix them. Okay, thanks for coming.